Okay, hello here, and welcome to Ms. Del Savio's AP Psychology class. I'm sorry I can't be here on our first day, but regardless, it's only about maybe 15 or 20 new students that I have, so we're going to go ahead and start the next unit, which is about emotion. So if you would take out your packet, I'm going to go ahead and put up the slideshow where it needs to be. And the packet is the same one that you were working on with your other teacher or with me if you had me. I'm going to go ahead and just give you a few minutes to do that. Mr. Butler is thankfully in for me today. And if you have any questions, you can ask him and he can relay them to me. I won't be available really to take any questions from him until this afternoon, but I'll be happy to answer them. So here we are. We finished motivation. Our last unit, we talked about all the different theories of motivation, starting with that evolutionary theory. And when we ended up with conflicts in motivation, that approach avoidance, etc. And today, what Mr. Butler handed out to you, or what you should have gotten from the side of the room, is a handout that you're going to try to fill out. It's just a bunch of multiple choice questions, practice questions about these different theories of emotion. I don't really care if you get them right. It's kind of more for me to get your name and get your attendance and just to see what I need to review with you when I return tomorrow. So let's go ahead and start with theories of emotion. And we're going to talk about how we experience an emotion. So think about this. You're waking up in the middle of the night. It's a loud noise, and that's what wakes you up. So what do you experience? Think about it from a physiological standpoint. What do you experience? So biologically, physiologically, what's happening? And then also, what do you experience emotionally? Like, how did you label this experience? So when you think about physiologically, I don't know about you, but if I wake up to a loud, unexpected noise in my house, I'm probably going to have my heart race. Maybe my throat's going to go a little dry. I might notice my body temperature gets raised. So I'm going to have my autonomic nervous system, very specifically my sympathetic, my arousal portion, you kind of set fire. And what I might experience emotionally, it really probably depends, is being frightened. So the question really comes, in what order did I experience this? Did I wake up frightened and then notice that my heart was racing? Or was my heart racing, and as a result of my heart racing, I say, oh, I'm frightened? And that's what these different emotion theories seek to explain. Why do we experience an emotion? How do we experience an emotion? And there are four theories, and we're actually doing them roughly in the order that they came about historically. And we're going to start with James-Lange, move on to Ken and Bard. And then we're going to put cognitive appraisal, which is the whole cognitive component, into emotion with Schachter, Singer, and Lazarus. So let's start with James-Lange theory. In James-Lange theory of emotion, as with any emotion, there's some external stimuli. Okay, so whether it's a noise in the house, whether or not somebody just surprised you with a gift, there's some stimulus. According to this theory, you will then have a physiological arousal. Your heart might beat a little bit higher, your throat might go a little bit dry. You might notice that you're like smiling. So that's that physiological arousal. And then you have an emotional experience. Oh, I'm sad. Oh, I'm happy. Oh, I'm angry. Oh, I'm disappointed. Okay. So there's the stimulus, an external event. There's some physiological arousal. And as a result of that arousal, we know what we're feeling. So we have that emotional experience. So basically, what this is stating is that emotion occurs, or any emotion occurs, as a result, a direct result of our physiological reaction to an event. Think about that. The only way you feel an emotion is because there's some very specific physiological or autonomic arousal to an event. And then we know what we're feeling and we label it. So when we talk about the James-Lange theory of emotion, I use the term autonomic nervous system. That's part of our peripheral nervous system. And that autonomic nervous system is the sympathetic, is what provides that physiological arousal. That sympathetic nervous system is supported by hormones of the endocrine system. So let's say it is a bump in the middle of the night. You might have an adrenaline rush. It's also your limbic system. If it's something like fear or anger, that amygdala is going to be activated. So let's take again the James-Lange theory of emotion and say there is a noise, an unexpected noise. Your heart pounds, that's your physiological arousal, and you feel fear. Okay? So the emotion of fear only occurs because our heart is pounding. If there's a noise and our heart doesn't pound, according to this theory, we will not feel fear. Now, there's been a lot of research on a particular hypothesis, and it's called the facial feedback hypothesis, that states that your facial expression directly affects your emotional experience. So even though you probably know this, you smile when you feel happy, but actually smiling can make you feel happy. So in other words, you're happy, you smile, but according to the facial feedback hypothesis, smiling, which is a physiological arousal, can make you feel happy as well, which kind of follows this James-Lange theory of emotion. Okay. And the way they tested it, and what you're seeing here, is that they had people take a pen and put it in their lips like this, which is essentially making you frown. And then they had other people put the pen in their teeth, which essentially is making you smile. And if you look at it, the pen in lips is the darker bar, and the pen in teeth is the lighter bar. And then they gave them certain scenarios that were humorous, and they were asked to later rank how humorous those scenarios were. And those people who were forced to smile ranked them as being higher on the scale of 1 to 5 in terms of their humor than those who were forced to frown. So let's take the James-Lange theory of emotion and talk about giving a speech in class. For some people, that's really a scary event, and they might experience dry mouth, sweaty palms, an elevated heart rate. And as a result of that, they would feel nervousness or excitement. And then you say to yourself, wait a second, the James-Lange theory of emotion says that I'm going to label my physiological arousal with an emotion. The question is, how do I know if I'm nervous or if I'm excited? And here's the problem with the James-Lange theory of emotion. Not every single emotion has a very specific pattern of autonomic arousal. In fact, if I'm surprised at a birthday party, somebody gives me a surprise birthday party, I might also get dry mouth, sweaty palms, and an elevated heart rate, and I'm excited. I'm not nervous. So how do I know what the difference is? How do we know which emotion we're actually feeling? So the weakness of the James-Lange theory is it relies on this premise or the idea that every single emotion that we have, and you can probably name hundreds of emotions if I gave you time to do that, every emotion is accompanied by a very unique pattern of physiological arousal, a unique amount of heart race, a unique amount of sweaty palms, a unique amount of blood pressure rising. That seems pretty impossible given how many different emotions there are. So that is the weakness of the James-Lange theory of emotion. But it was one of the first theories of emotion that was investigated by William, I can't remember what Lange's first name was, but the two scientists were James, last name James, and Lange. So what seems to be obvious, should be obvious, is that obviously if it's a bump in the middle of the night and my heart races, I'm probably going to know that it's fear. But if it's a bump in the middle of the night and I happen to be awake and I know that my parents are coming home, so I expect that there's going to be noise, I'm not going to feel fear. In other words, I think about this. There is some kind of cognitive component to it. So when you have, of course, James-Lange says there's a stimulus, an arousal, and an emotional experience. But what we're going to add to this with another theory is the idea that we appraise the situation. Now, when I say appraise, I don't mean like appraise a piece of jewelry like for a dollar amount. I'm talking about appraising, why am I feeling this way? Why is my heart racing? Why is it hard to swallow? So we're going to talk about another theory that came on top of the James-Lange theory, and it was two researchers, Schachter and Singer, and it's called the Schachter-Singer or two-factor theory of emotion, in which there is a stimulus, some external event, there is a physiological arousal. Those two follow the same pattern as James-Lange. However, Before you can feel the emotion, according to this theory, we do an appraisal. Now, sometimes it's a pretty automatic appraisal, but sometimes it may actually be oh, what is that noise and why am I hearing it? It's a cognitive appraisal. To what do I attribute this arousal? Why is my heart racing? Okay. And when you ask yourself that, you will then come up with an emotional experience, which means that the physiological arousal does not have to be unique for every single emotion. You can have the same physiological arousal for fear, for anger, for surprise, etc. Okay, so the important thing about Schachter-Singer, as compared to James-Lange, is that Schachter-Singer says yes stimulus, yes arousal. Those two happen in that order, but then cognitive appraisal and then the emotional experience. So the cognitive appraisal of the arousal, of the physiological arousal, precedes or comes before the emotional experience. So Schachter-Singer's two-factor theory of emotion would say that there's a noise, your heart begins to pound, and you appraise the situation. I'm home alone. I'm not expecting anyone. I'm going to feel fear. So the appraisal that you're home alone and your heart is pounding precedes that emotional experience of fear. But let's say there's a noise, your heart is pounding, and you hear your parents laughing and being noisy as they return from a late night out. Now you're just surprised because you didn't think your parents would come home that late, or maybe you're just annoyed because you really would rather go to sleep, or maybe you say, okay, my heart was pounding because it was just like a noise, but now I realize it's nothing, and so I don't feel fear. Yeah. So according to Schachter-Singer's two-factor theory, your emotional experience is dependent on your cognitive appraisal, your interpretation of the situation, which is kind of powerful when you think about it, because it means that your emotions can be altered by how you think, how you appraise something. Here's the problem, though. There is a weakness to this theory. This idea of a cognitive appraisal, it seems like there's some emotions that are pretty automatic, like fear. Like we don't necessarily even have our hearts pounding until we appraise the situation. In other words, I might wake up to a noise and my heart's not pounding, but I appraise the situation and then I feel fear. Like, so does it really have to be physiological arousal first? So that is definitely a weakness of the Singer two-factor theory of emotion. And give you a chance to write that down. Okay, we're going to move on to another theory of emotion. This one actually historically came after James-Lange, before Schachter-Singer. But these two different theorists, Cannon and Bard, really felt that there was a stimulus, an external stimulus, and that an emotion was a product of two simultaneous things, a physiological arousal and the emotional experience. So in other words, what they said happened is that some stimulus would happen, like, the noise in the dark. All the information's coming through your thalamus, except for smell, right? All the incoming sensory information's being routed through your thalamus, and your thalamus will take that information and arouse you appropriately and give you an emotional experience. And those things happen independently, but also simultaneously. So if we think about the Cannon-Bard theory, what we would say is that the autonomic nervous system gets activated by the thalamus, and the amygdala gets activated by the thalamus, right? And it happens at the same time. So we'll take a stimulus again. We have a physiological arousal, an emotional experience that happens simultaneously and independently. That's Cannon-Bard. And let's put it into the context of the noise. You wake up to a noise in the middle of the night. At the same time, simultaneously, your heart's pounding and you feel fear. Again, no appraisal in this at all, just your heart's pounding and you feel fear. Okay, so your heart pounds and you experience the emotion of fear simultaneously, and that's the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion. If this were James-Lange, there'd be a noise, your heart pounding, and fear. It's a linear progress. Here with Cannon-Bard, that's simultaneous. The weakness of this theory is that what if you wake up to a noise that you never heard before? That's a new situation. You may not be clear as to what you're actually feeling. That emotion may not be all that clear to you. So Cannon-Barth's theory of emotion, because there's no cognitive component to it, also has some weaknesses to it. And it won't be a surprise that the people who studied Cannon-Barth's theory, who were cognitive psychologists, actually revised the theory, just like Schachter-Singer revised the James-Lange theory. We have cognition coming into play where there's a stimulus, just like Cannon-Barth's, a physiological arousal and an emotional experience at the same time, but in between the two, just after the stimulus occurs and is acknowledged, is an appraisal of the situation. So there's a stimulus. This is called Lazarus's theory. So Lazarus, like Schachter and Singer, added cognition. This time, though, the cognitive appraisal was added right after the stimulus. There's an event, an external event, an appraisal of the event, and then a simultaneous arousal and emotion. So a cognitive, in this case, a cognitive appraisal comes before both the physiological arousal and the emotional experience, which occur simultaneously. Okay, so let's take a look at it again in the context of what the scenario we've been talking about. There's a noise, there's a cognitive appraisal, I'm home alone, and as a result of that appraisal, that noise is happening and I'm home alone, both your heart pounds and you feel fear simultaneously at the same time. So you appraise the noise, in this case, as threatening. And that threatening noise leads to a physiological arousal and an emotional experience, heart pounding and fear. Of course, if we go back to the scenario where there's a noise, you then appraise the noise. Oh, my parents are laughing and being noisy as they return from a late night out. There might be a slight rise in heartbeat, and then you're also feeling surprise at the same time. So there may be no physiological arousal, but that doesn't matter. The point is you wouldn't have even had a physiological arousal because you've appraised the noise as being something that's not really important or anything to feel anything about. So the weakness of Lazarus's theory of emotion is the idea that we always think before we feel. I mean, isn't it true that sometimes there are emotions that seem to come about automatically or immediately? Like you hear you're having a test tomorrow and you immediately react to it physiologically and you immediately have some kind of a fear response or a nervous response. Okay, I'm going to have you practice, and you also have on the sheet of paper that Mr. Butler gave to you, there are some questions. They're not the same questions, but they are similar. And as I'm going through the practice here, you may want to review some of those questions. Which of these is which theory? Let me move my screen here. So there are 4 theories that we went through, and I want you to go ahead and pick which belongs to which. So on the upper left, you have a person about to give speech in a class, their heart's pounding, and they feel anxiety. Which theory does that look like? And so let's be clear. This is your stimulus, this is your physiological arousal, and that's your emotional experience. Hopefully you came up that this was James-Lange theory. Okay. There's no cognitive appraisal, so it certainly can't be Lazarus and it cannot be Schachter-Singer. Okay, here's another one. You're about to give a speech in class, and simultaneously your heart pounds and you feel anxiety. No cognitive appraisal here, so it cannot be Lazarus and it cannot be Schachter-Singer. It is indeed Cannon-Barth. Now I'm going to go down here to the one on the bottom right. We're about to give a speech in class. Your heart is pounding. You then say, this could be fun. I'm kind of excited. And you feel excitement, to give this speech. That's how you interpret your heart pounding. It's like, wow, I'm about to do something fun, like getting on a roller coaster, right? It's about to be fun, excitement. Which theory is this? We do have a cognitive appraisal here, so it has to be Schachter or Lazarus. And hopefully you realized it was Schachter because it's simply modifying the James-Lange theory of emotion. And then, of course, we're left with Lazarus's theory, about to give a speech in class. You say, hey, I can't wait, it's going to be fun. And so your heart pounds in excitement, and you feel excitement. Okay, so there's our different theories of emotion. Okay, I'm going to do a couple of multiple choice questions here. We have Leo and Caitlin, and they're both experiencing feelings about their date tonight. They're on a date together. Leo has had bad dates lately, and so he feels fear and dejection. Caitlin, meanwhile, has had very good dates, so she feels excited and happy. According to Richard Lazarus's appraisal theory, what would be true? Now, the first answer, we haven't even gone over some of this stuff. So, as hopefully you have found out by now, when you take our multiple choice questions, we take questions from the AP exam. And sometimes they include responses with terms we haven't talked about yet in class. So you can automatically get rid of A. But let's go on to B. Leo and Caitlin both experience a physiological response and feel either fear or excitement simultaneously. Okay, we don't really see anything yet here about the order in which it's happening, or certainly nothing about it happening simultaneously. Leo and Caitlin experience different physiological responses to the impending date and interpret their emotional responses accordingly. Well, they both feel excited, or at least they both feel like, well, at least we don't actually see, I'm looking here. No, we don't even see what their physiological response is. Since it's not even mentioned in the question, it cannot be the right answer. Leo is able to identify his response as fear more quickly than Caitlin can identify her response as excitement, because fear is more evolutionarily important and thus is processed more quickly. Okay. We, again, haven't discussed this yet, but we certainly don't know, based upon the question stem, that Leo identified his response more quickly. We just don't know. So it cannot be correct, which leaves us with E. Leo and Caitlin have an immediate unconscious interpretation of the scenario. It leads them to simultaneously, and again, remember, this is Lazarus's appraisal theory. So you have to have the stimulus, the cognitive appraisal of the stimulus, okay, and then the simultaneous emotional response and physiological arousal. So Leo and Caitlin have an immediate unconscious interpretation of the scenario. There's your cognitive interpretation, appraisal, which leads them to simultaneously both label their feelings as positive or negative and have the appropriate physiological response. So the important part of this question was you have to apply this scenario to Richard Lazarus's appraisal theory. So let's talk about emotions that do seem to come automatically, like that bump in the middle of the night that seems to spark fear, or somebody taking your you drive in late to school and you see somebody's taking your parking spot, and that anger that you feel, or your friends decide to throw you a surprise party and you walk into your house that you weren't expecting and the lights go on, everybody says surprise. So which psychological perspective supports the idea? And I'm talking about not emotional theory, but going back to our psychological perspectives: humanism, psychodynamic, behaviorism, behavior genetics, evolutionary, cognitive. Which psychological perspective would support the idea that quick emotional responses enhance the ability of a species to survive? Think about that. When you hear enhance the ability of a species to survive, we're talking about fitness. We talked about in our last unit, or last part of this unit, fitness, or our genes' ability to survive. And that was the evolutionary perspective. Some emotions seem automatic, like fear and surprise, but which theories of emotion require some cognitive appraisal before an emotion will be experienced? In other words, we just went over 4 different emotion theories. There were 2 of them that required some kind of cognitive appraisal before an emotion itself would be experienced. And which 2 were they? And hopefully you come up with Schachter, Singer, and Lazarus. Okay, so again, the cognitive appraisal occurs in Lazarus, and it also occurs here in Schachter, Singer. So let's, though, go back to this idea that some emotions not only seem, but actually are automatic, because the evolutionary response to things like fear, anger, and surprise has helped our species to survive. So Zhejiang and LeDoux, and I don't think I pronounced that correctly. I always forget how to pronounce it, the first person's name, but I'll figure it out and tell you tomorrow. Um, but this theory says that some emotions really are automatic. Emotions like fear, anger, and surprise, the ones that help us to survive. Okay. And what this theory basically says is that there are two routes to emotion, or two routes to emotion. Let's start down here. This seems a little confusing, but let's think about it. We've got a stimulus, like the bump in the middle of the night. It's an external stimulus. We hear it. It's going to be processed up through, the brainstem into the thalamus, what will be routed to the appropriate place, including the part of the cerebral cortex, in this case, the temporal lobe, because we're hearing it, right? But to the cerebral cortex and to the amygdala. So what Zhejiang and LeDoux say is that there's a stimulus, the thalamus recognizes the stimulus and sends it directly to the amygdala for an emotional experience. And it does so when that experience, that stimulus, is novel, meaning it's new, or it is, from an evolutionary perspective, something that we have learned, we've kind of passed down to be afraid of, like loud noises in the middle of the night. Now, that's LeDoux, but if we look at Schachter-Singer, that's more the high road to the emotion. So we call this emotion that you feel without any kind of appraisal or thought process that goes behind it, or even any physiological arousal immediately. We call that the low road. And that's all because of our amygdala. Our amygdala is responsive to some of those evolutionary components, like some of the stimuli that we should be responding to immediately without any delay. The high road, though, takes that information and takes it to the cortex. And what Schachter-Singer and Lazarus say is that we think about it and then we respond appropriately. Yes, we may still activate our amygdala, but we think about it. But that's not what LeDoux was saying. So are these theories actually compatible? Probably. If we look at Schachter and Singer and Lazarus, there are certain emotions like guilt, dissonance, remember, happiness, love, that there probably is some kind of appraisal of the situation. What am I really feeling here? But something like fear and anger probably support the LeDoux's theory. In other words, there is a low road to emotion where immediately we're expected to respond in order to survive. And fear and anger would be two emotions that would be important. Again, we're going to practice. We have Tahani, not tahini. That would be like a sesame paste. Okay, Tahani is hiking in the woods and sees some movement in the trees. She immediately tenses up, and a few moments later, she realizes that the trees were just rustling in the wind. So she calms down. According to LeDoux, Tahani's reaction, and I'm talking about this first reaction here, is due to the fact that, okay, A, emotions are irrational and bear no relation to the stimuli we perceive. Hopefully you've seen that that's not true. Everything starts with a stimulus. B, there is a fast processing path that sends sensory information directly to the amygdala, causing Tahani's initial fear response, and a slower processing path that processes the content of sensory information first, which overrode Tahani's fear response. So remember LeDoux, the low road to emotion. This is exactly what we're talking about here, okay? This one, D and E, are Schachter and Singer, and I'll probably go over those with you tomorrow. When given a drug that produced general arousal, when I say general arousal, I mean arousal of the sympathetic nervous system, an elevated heart rate, etc. So when given a drug that produced general arousal, research participants placed in a room with a happy confederate. And to remind you, I think we've discussed this in my class, a confederate is somebody who's part of the experiment. They're kind of in on the experiment. They're an actor. They've been hired, okay, to take part of the experiment. So we have a drug. It produces autonomic arousal. And the research participant is placed in a room with a happy person. And and the happy confederate described the person, who's in that room, the research participant, basically then interpreted their general arousal as being happy. They looked around, they saw a happy confederate, somebody who's acting happy. They're like, oh, I must be happy too. While those placed in a room with an angry confederate described their emotional state as angry. So again, they have a drug in them their heart's racing, they're with somebody who appears to be angry. Now they interpret their heart racing as being angry. Which theory of emotion best explains the results? Now, first of all, I use the word interpret, so you know it can't be Lange. It can't be Ekman because we haven't studied him yet. It can't be Cannon-Bard because there's no cognitive appraisal, and we haven't studied the opponent process theory. So you're left with Schachter and Singer, and that is exactly what it is. Which theory of emotion explains why, when we frown, we feel unhappy? So think about it. Which is coming first, the physiological arousal or the emotional experience? In this case, frowning is the physiological arousal or the response, and then we have an emotional experience. And that's very much the James-Lange theory. Okay. So what I'm going to have you all do now is to go ahead and to start the multiple choice. I think there's 8 multiple choice questions. You can work together on them and sort of go through your notes and sort of figure out for these theories of emotion, can you answer these multiple choice questions? Certainly, if you wanted to do it as a class, you could as well. Make sure your name is on the top of it and your class period. And if you would all place them into the black box, the inbox, which is in the front of the room. Those of you who are in my class before know where it is. There's a few of you who may not. So if you could direct them, that would be great. And I will see you all tomorrow.